Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on a Friday. My name is Emily Zinger. I am the Southeast Asia Digital Librarian at Cornell University, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to this, our third webinar in the series Across the Archives. Before I begin, I just want to thank a few supporters who have made today's talk possible. First, thank you to Cornell's Southeast Asia program, especially Ava White, who is here with us today managing the technical side of the event. If you have any questions or technical issues, please do just send a direct message to SEAP Cornell, and Ava here will get you sorted. Also, thank you to the Committee on Research Materials on Southeast Asia and the Southeast Asia Digital Library for additionally sponsoring this webinar. Thank you to the librarians, archivists, and specialists who have had a hand in making accessible all of the amazing collections that our speaker today will highlight. In particular, Hao Fan at Northern Illinois University, and Ryan Wolfson Ford and Joshua Quick at the Library of Congress. In my role as digital librarian, I'm keenly aware of the benefits that arise from making archival materials available, both online and in person. We in this field have a duty to preserve these materials for future use and to reduce the barriers that stand between them and the scholars, students, and curious individuals who seek to explore them. But ensuring that a collection is available and ensuring that it is used, those are actually two very different things. And I often find that while researchers are aware of the collections at their own institutions, it's much more difficult for any single researcher to get a clear picture of all the relevant collections across the landscape of academic institutions that house them. And so we conceived of this series, Across the Archives, that brings together in conversation similar collections that are being held at geographically disparate institutions. And we've invited Dr. Loos to speak about her experience researching anti-communist Thai posters, in particular, a collection at the Library of Congress and a counterpart collection at Northern Illinois University. And I can share links to digitized versions of those collections. Our hope is that this talk will serve as a fascinating look into the archival research that informs Dr. Loos's current book project, tentatively titled How to Be an Anti-Communist, Information, Expertise, and Culture in Cold War Thailand, while also deconstructing those institutional silos within which our archival collections can become trapped. Now let me introduce our speaker. Tamara Loos is Professor of Southeast Asian History at Cornell University, is currently Chair of the History Department, and has served as Director of the Southeast Asia Program. Her first book, Subject Siam, Family, Law, and Colonial Modernity in Thailand, explores the implications of Siam's position as both a colonized and colonizing power in Southeast Asia. It is the first study that integrates the Malay Muslim South and the gendered core of law into Thai history. Her most recent book, Bones Around My Neck, offers a critical history of Siam during the era of high colonialism through the dramatic and tragic life of a pariah prince, Pristung Chumsai. Her teaching and articles focus on an array of topics, including sex and politics, subversion and foreign policy, sexology, transnational sexualities, comparative law, sodomy, and gender in Asia. She has been interviewed by the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and other global media outlets about political protests in Thailand. And she's here with us today. So attendees, I ask that you please keep yourself muted during the talk. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll be moderating a Q&A after Dr. Loos's lecture, and I'll be keeping track of everything that you ask in the meantime. Tamara, I now invite you to begin.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And I have a few people I also want to acknowledge kind of replicates your list. I want to thank Emily Zinger at Cornell and Ryan Wolfson Ford at the Library of Congress, also Hao Fan at NIU, and David Langbert at the National Archives 2 in College Park. I also want to thank Mike Ratana Sangchan. I don't think he's here today. but he and Matt Phillips, who I also want to thank, have shared some of their archival records with me. And even though they're not in this talk per se, I'm just grateful whenever people share what they find at the archive. So Emily mentioned that the Thai anti-communist poster collection at NIU has drawn significant attention from scholars. And now the Library of Congress has digitized a kind of overlapping collection of the posters. And that's why they asked me to talk about how I plan to use the posters. So I'm going to say at the outset that I'm a historian who really likes documents. And this is the first time I'm using visual sources as well. So I appreciate insights from those of you who are very savvy about reading visual materials. I'm at the very beginning of this project on Cold War era Thailand, and I haven't had a lot of time to review the secondary scholarship. Instead, I've delved directly into primary sources in search of what I hope will be my contribution to Cold War studies. And so far, I think I have two broad contributions. The first is I want to address something that Cold War studies have so far largely neglected, and that is that I want to integrate the intimate, the experiential, the sexual, and the gendered into this study. This is not a critique of existing scholarship so much as an acknowledgement that little exists in official documentation about such issues. So finding the experiential and the intimate requires either a different set of archives or reading the existing archives differently. And I plan to do both. The second contribution is that I want to highlight various kinds of agencies exercised by people in Thailand, and I want to decenter the US and its concerns to the extent that I can. Thai leadership shaped the information campaign directed at its population, but was funded by Americans. So I concentrate on local agency, not in a way that lets the US off the hook, but in a way that circumscribes the power of the United States by showing how locals directed it in ways that buttressed particular political factions, particular economic policies, and visions of hierarchy over others. In this second endeavor, I actually have the opposite problem with official sources on US-Thailand materials. The issue instead is the sheer volume of US information, which I put in quotes, or propaganda produced during the Cold War. There's a ton of it out there in various archives. A couple of people have already written books about this. Many more could be written. The propaganda I focus on today comes from these posters that were produced with US funds in Thailand in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the posters came to my attention because it was COVID and I was trying to find sources and materials that were closer to home since I couldn't go to Thailand. And in a conversation with David Langbart and with Ryan Wolfson Ford, these posters came up. Ryan actually showed me a couple of them. And so I started to attend to them, research them as much as I could, and suddenly started seeing those posters everywhere. That's when I saw that they were online at NIU. And then also in Thailand, when I did get a chance to go back last year, I saw these posters at MAIM, the Museum of Art in Chiang Mai. While I was there at MAIM, I met an artist and professor, Tasanai Setaseri. Actually, I should show you, maybe I should show you a poster so you can have a nice visual. Here's one of my favorite posters, which is about the family. And if you can read the script down there, it says Communist Ru Seripap, so communist country or free country. And on the communist side of the poster, it says the communist government trains kids to be spies who turn in their parents for hiding crops that they must turn over to the central state. And the freedom side, which is obviously the Thai side, it says the contented and stable family. It's the wealthy and stable family is the unified foundation of the nation. Change that. Well, when I got to Chiang Mai and met with Professor Tassanai, we had a conversation, and he explained that he was similarly inspired by this kind of Cold War propaganda, and he used it to sort of help inspire his 2023 exhibition, which he called Cold War: The Mysterious. The image that I'm showing you right now is one of a small series of 4 untitled ones. They're called Cold War toys, even though they don't technically have a title. I never quite understood that. They're gigantic. This takes up a wall, and they're actually really gorgeous. They're spectacular. Tassanai layered his untitled series of 4 on top of enlarged communism or freedom posters. So I'll show you this in a minute. You can see in the back, it says, Communist Russerie Pop. This is the actual poster that he used and blew up multiple times to create this particular piece. So you can kind of see that this communism or freedom poster peeks through the shimmering surface of Tassanai's collage, which is otherwise overlaid, at least in this piece, with space aliens and spaceships. You can see Disney's Mickey Mouse, the cat and mouse cartoon characters Tom and Jerry, Popeye's in there. There are astronauts, toy robots, rockets, and tanks. It's no coincidence that he uses these because Thailand was bombarded with images of NASA astronauts, animated films, and military hardware in this period of time. If you dig underneath this, you can kind of see the hints of this poster number 10. And this poster is about private property. So on the communist side of the poster, the caption states that under communism, people have no right to own land, and everyone is forced to work like cattle or water buffalo. And the freedom side says Thai farmers love and cherish farming on land that they privately own, or land that they own. I think you'll be interested to note, just as a side piece here, that Tassanai found these posters not at Jattajak Market or some kind of old bookstore, but he found them on NIU's website, along with 3 others that he used as the basis for that 4-piece series I mentioned. I'll just show you a couple of them before I talk about them. I'll flip back, but here is one of his other communism or freedom pieces of art, and I did find the actual poster that's in the background, which I could talk about later. Here's yet another one. Lots of Japanese monsters. And this is his 4th one. And it's so dark, I can't really tell what's behind it. I have to dig a little deeper for that. But let me get back to this original one that I want to talk about. Tassanai's technique involves layers upon layers of paint, cloth, and paper, much of which was handmade and dyed by the artist. His collage technique is purposefully archaeological, a term that similarly applies to the history of the Cold War in Thailand. Now, while I sought to unearth maybe the comparatively boring mechanics of the production and propaganda impact of the posters, Tassanai exposed the offspring produced by capitalism's marriage to militarism: rockets, weapons, and the commercial celebration of violence in cartoons, toy guns, and tanks. We both see development, human rights, and democracy and other ideals propagated by the US in Thailand as layered on top of authoritarianism, unfreedoms, environmental degradation, and so on. So last year, while I was on leave, I tried to hunt down all of the posters that I could find, and it turned out there's actually a series of posters that have 30 different posters in the collection, and they're housed across a variety of archives, which have already been mentioned. Some are also at College Park in Nara too. And then a couple posters are still missing. I can't find them. So I wanted to know more about the production of ephemeral propaganda. who drew them, who created the messaging, and how did Thai audiences interpret the images? I found some of these answers actually at NARA too, the National Archives and Research Administration, where they have massive documentation that was produced by the U.S. Information Agency, or USIA. I refer to it as USIS, USIS. That was the branch that existed in Bangkok. The materials are just overwhelming. There's so many, and most of them really are about politics and economics, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them have some posters such as this. So the reason why there's so much material, I think, is kind of encapsulated in some data about the year 1959 alone. In 1959, the USIA translated over 500 US books into 23 Asian languages. Around 3 million copies of books found their way into the hands of local populations. USIS libraries in Thailand were literally armed with books, pamphlets, and comics that taught a curated version of US history. Why so much? US officials worried that the Thai government was insufficiently concerned about the threat posed by communism in the region, a naivete that they worried could lead to neutralism or worse. To rectify this, US Ambassador to Thailand, Bill Donovan, started the psychological indoctrination program called PIP to convince Thais that communism was a serious threat. Now, many of you have probably heard of Donovan. He was the former head of the Office of Strategic Services, and in the early 1950s, he was, I think, the second US ambassador to Thailand for just a couple of years. Anyway, this joint US-Thai government PIP program focused on promoting anti-communism, national stability, and Buddhism. These are themes that are prevalent in a lot of the posters. And USIS in Bangkok hired admin or former admin, and also a lot of former journalists. One who's named Victor Steer, and there's an oral history that he's given, and I'm taking some quotes from that oral history. He wrote some of the pamphlets, scripts, and stories about the perils of communism in the 1950s, and he said it was like whistling in the wind when it came to persuading Thais that communism threatened them. Many of you also know, thanks to Craig Reynolds' work, that Bill Donovan paid American linguist Bill Gudney and Jit Pumisak to translate the Thai's manifesto. He really thought if Thais could actually read it, it wasn't good for them. And ironically, Pumisak became a communist, later by the government. USIS Bangkok also bombarded Thailand's population with anti-communist materials from the 1950s on, and they managed to cover most of Thailand in about 2 inches of paper, according to one of the USIS officials there. The production of pamphlets and publications is so massive that they guzzled the majority of ink and paper imported to all of Southeast Asia at that time. The US government considered Thailand the cork in the bottle containing the spread of communism, and their preferred method to halt the spread was by what they called a saturation campaign that flooded Thailand's remote villages and urban centers with anti-communist propaganda materials. NARA 2 houses only a fraction of this, which is still quite a bit. A lot of what I like to imagine is the most interesting materials were actually thrown away. When I talked to David Langbert, who's one of the archivists there, who's been there a long time, he said that that decisions were made by earlier archivists about what materials were important and which were not important to keep. And so a lot of the unimportant stuff was cultural or things that didn't have to do with family or intimacy and that sort of thing. So Langbart has attempted to reverse this trend in archival decision-making, thankfully, but we just don't know what else is out there or was once out there. Let's see. I am going to move back to the family poster. This kind of ephemera about the Cold War in Thailand opens a window onto aspects of the era that I think normally drop out of histories of the US-Thailand alliance during the Cold War, which is, as I've mentioned, dominated by military, economic, and police, especially border police relations, all of which is great. But in my book, I hope to use each poster as a jumping off point into chapters on contents that are loosely related to the posters. For example, in this poster here about the family, I will use it to talk about the Cold War ideal of the Thai family, the introduction of family planning during the Cold War that made Thailand a global example of successful family planning. Ajahn Bin Gao has written about this as well. I'll also use it to talk about, obviously, the worship of the king and Buddhism as linked to the family, these myths of rural abundance, and so on. And you also get the sense here that the family, at least at this point, is multi-generational, and the idea that 2 kids might be enough, even if that wasn't really enforced till a little bit later. So materials generated by USIS in Thailand haven't been analyzed for their content and impact beyond their obviously anti-communist hype. In terms of the posters themselves, I want to know how they work. How did they work at the time for people? What kind of political work did they do, or cultural work? Who made them? And so on. What I've found out so far is that the posters obviously were paid for by USIS, which hired local Thai artists and had them make anti-communism meaningful to Thais. One of the poster drawers is actually quite famous, Poyuk Ngao Gradang, who worked his entire life at USIS. He became known as the Walt Disney of Thailand. Later, he made the first animated film, and he also made animated films that are up online at I think at Nara, that you can see that are anti-communist. In any case, he drew images of the family, Buddhism, farming, social etiquette, public health, and the monarchy, which were kind of Thai-specific cultural vehicles to convey messages about abstract political belief systems like anti-communism. And based on the posters, this is how I found it was him. I'm sorry this is so blurry, but this is a different poster series. And in the very, very lower right-hand corner, you can see the artist's signature. It's rare that the artists had their signatures on the posters, but this is how I found Payut's name. In any case, I'm going to flip to the next one. Based on these posters, you can see that teaching recipients how to be anti-communist meant training them in forms of political obedience to the monarchy, to heteronormative based social hierarchy. And I just want to say this kind of training was aspirational. It's what authorities hoped the posters would convey. But how were messages received? How did people actually see these posters and interpret them? That's a different kind of question. Fortunately for historians, USIS was concerned with the efficacy of their propaganda, and they really fixated on data collection. That's going to be a subject of one of my chapters, that data collection in Thailand wasn't up to par according to USIS, and so they were instrumental in creating certain kinds of survey companies in Thailand, which I'll talk about in a different talk. In any case, USIS frequently conducted surveys on various sectors of the Thai population to see what they learned from the materials. Not very many of these surveys still exist. I was able to find 1 or 2, so I was very happy about that. It took about a year to find. But there's a USIS survey that was conducted about rural Thai understandings of a set of 8 of these posters. And I think the surveys provide a unique opportunity to analyze not just the propaganda imagery, but interpretations and reactions by Thai villagers and officials. And I should say that the surveys and these posters themselves were classified, but they have since been declassified. All right, so in the one survey that I'm going to talk about today is, it was conducted in the late 1960s from 1968 to 69. Thai surveyors interviewed over 1,000 Thai-speaking individuals in 13 provinces in the north and the northeast and the south. So even though these posters were distributed all over the country, the survey sought feedback specifically from people living in these 3 peripheries. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, the Communist Party of Thailand targeted these areas in the guerrilla war they launched against the Thai government in 1965. Also, the Royal Thai government and the US considered the Northeast, which bordered on Indochina, at higher risk for communist infiltration. So they disseminated posters and pamphlets there to a much greater degree than elsewhere. And the USIS survey was broken down by lots of different categories: geography, villages, districts, different ranges of the population, like leaders, villagers, and so forth. They looked at gender, age, literacy, and the level of education as well. Thai surveyors also conducted oral interviews with recipients, which allowed them to include illiterates in their survey information. So the surveys suggest that 98% of the target groups were always leadership and almost always male. So in this case, district and village level officials and educators who saw the posters. Thongchai Winichagun and Pracha Suriyanon, both of whom were student activists in the 1970s, recall the posters. US Peace Corps volunteers in Thailand, who I interviewed, recall seeing them as well. One volunteer brought back several of these posters to the US and donated them to NIU, which is why they're online now for consumption. So I think I have time to look at 2 or 3 of the posters and the survey results, just to make a couple of the points. So the poster that you're looking at right now was likely the first image distributed, and it's the first image in the survey that they asked questions about. As you can see, I'll just go over the caption here. On the communist side, it says that communists are the images of the monarchy and force people to blindly obey their leaders. On the freedom side, obviously the Thai side, it says, in our country, the king is cherished by the Thai people. And this is an image drawn by Payu. So it positions the Thai monarchy as the paragon of government systems in the free world. And that statement itself should raise eyebrows, given that the US promoted non-communism and alleged democratic forms of government, not monarchy, elsewhere in the world. In Thailand, the US government, the US military, the State Department, and USIS worked very intimately with the Royal Thai government. So they utilized the image of the monarch in ways that both governments approved. Now, I've put the photograph there on the right side of the screen. This is a picture that, as far as I can tell, was taken in 1955 on the king's first visit to Nakhon Phanom in 1955, as I said. So it was before the posters were made. But that photo is ubiquitous. I mean, anyone who's been to Thailand or seen films about the king before movies and so forth will have seen this particular photograph, which expresses the king's intimate relationship with his villagers, and it also expresses their adoration of him. And I think it might have been used as the model for this illustration. There's actually another poster that has a very similar kind of iconography. Now, posters like this were aspirational in that they served to educate the rural population about their monarch's existence. While one literate village leader from the north declared in the survey results that, this is a quote, "There's a picture of the king who's the symbol of national unity. The people respect him highly and are loyal to him." And that was sort of his interpretation of the right side of this image. But it's important to remember that many other villagers failed to recognize the king at all. According to survey results, 27% of Northerners and 14% of villagers in the Northeast and the South failed to recognize him. As many as half of the elderly and those without formal education in the North, quote, did not know that the man pictured on the right was the king. They interpreted the image in a variety of ways. So these are all kind of quotes that I'm putting in my own words for you. One person interpreted this as an old woman giving flowers to a policeman. Another person understood this as somebody paying homage to an old woman, sort of flipping what the intended message was. And then curiously, somebody wrote, "Southern ties are holding a meeting." And the only thing I can think of for why they might have interpreted that way is if you look at the people in the background, like clearly trying to show a multi-ethnic, multi-religious group in the background. So in propagating anti-communism, USIS and the Royal Thai government also introduced and promoted Bangkok's king to those in provincial areas where it was not yet a household name. I think what's more shocking about that is the date of the survey, 1969, which is 2 decades after King Bhumibol ascended the throne and became a mass media star featured in Thai television, radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, and magazines. So let's see, another survey revealed similar statistics about King Bhumipun's identification. Now this is poster number 15 in the series. The communist caption, "Communists do not respect elders." In this picture, we see red guards beating a helpless teacher. And on the freedom side, we see we Thais owe a lot to our elders and teachers who have been sharing their knowledge with us. The point of the poster was to reveal the lack of distinctions in proper social etiquette in a communist country where moral hierarchies and also age hierarchies were flipped versus the case in Thailand where young people were taught to respect their elders, including teachers. Yet the survey asked inferential questions as well. So in this case, they asked about recognition of political leaders like Mao Zedong. This image is a much more iconic picture of Mao Zedong than the previous one, and also King Bhumibol, who's up there behind the SEAP lettering. So in the survey about this poster 15, 1/3 of Northerners and a little over half of those without an education in the Northeast could not recognize the man in the portrait as on the right side as Thailand's king. Okay, so I'm going to return to Tassanai's poster that he used for one of his exhibit pieces. And this one, again, is about private property. So you can read that if you'd like. When villagers were surveyed, they did not focus on the intended message of this poster. And the intended message is that capitalism allowed private land ownership, whereas communism collectivized land and forced people to work on it. Instead, villagers in the remarks fixated on the male bodies pulling the plow on the communist side. You kind of see them there. They did not believe that communists used humans as draft animals. Some attributed the primitive farming methods to a shortage of buffalo. They're trying to explain this rather than to the communist system. One district leader argued against the credibility of humans being forced to pull a plow, and that if it were true, he expected to see a photograph of it. Like photographs really captured the real truth in a way that drawings wouldn't. And then I'm gonna quote cite a long quote by one of the people interviewed. So it says, "Some pictures appear to exaggerate the truth. People now get information from many sources and learn that most communist countries are also well-developed and progressive. Such pictures might be unbelievable to them. For example, the picture on poster number 10, this one, which shows the compulsion of labor may be exaggerated. This is because the communists are also human beings. They have lives and spirits similar to ours. If a communist government treats people like that, who would bear it? How could they still be alive? Wouldn't they just all commit suicide?" So that's the kind of interpretation, somebody who just finds these posters ridiculous. The posters then were like a bomb with an incendiary range far broader than the authorities had the means to control. So they exploded in multiple directions rather than consistently hitting their mark. Regional audiences, many members of which were illiterate, had to interpret imagery without the benefit of understanding the edifying Thai captions, and they often misinterpreted the propaganda, projecting onto the images their own unruly narratives about the Thai government and its communist enemies. These posters might even have been counterproductive. So in one of the comments about this particular poster, look to the communist side, and you can see a cadre with a clipboard there. One of the people surveyed interpreted this as surveillance of Thais, right? He said people are compelled to construct a road while the community development workers watching them, right? So he thought that was actually the Thai side. And of course, roads and community development units were part of Thailand's massive development plans funded by the United States and then often led by experts trained in the United States. The survey results about villagers' interpretations of the posters reveal a great deal more complexity than perhaps USIS expected. Even when Payut's posters effectively conveyed the basic message that life in a communist state was worse than that in a free Thailand, these posters overshot their mark through exaggeration of both the evils of communism and the abundance in Thailand, which made villagers suspicious that the posters were what they were, simply propaganda rather than realistic. In fact, some of them wrote that life in Thailand was not always as good as presented, so communism couldn't possibly be that bad. The survey reveals blind spots, weaknesses, and negative aspects in the Thai system as well, not all of which I was able to cover today, but in other posters, when they were compiling the survey results from people in the South, they learned that some Southerners, even the Thai-speaking individuals interviewed about the posters, considered the Thai state malicious and violent. Many illiterates across the country could not recognize the king. This is something I tried to show today. And many Thais understood that their own state was not responsible for or capable of delivering abundance, whether it was for food or medical aid. The survey also clarified to USIS and the Royal Thai government that additional educational work had to be conducted to guide provincial populations to the correct interpretations of such propaganda. Despite the high percentage of poster misunderstanding among illiterates, USIS concluded that the posters were effective and that they should continue to be produced and sent with the monthly packets to local leaders, educators, and others. The Communism or Freedom series represented one small portion of the total media directed at the population. posters and booklets about development, public health, land ownership, communism as antithetical to Buddhism, the life of US President Lincoln, the US overcoming slavery, Soviet imperialism, many, many more themes littered the countryside and urban spaces. I'll conclude by stressing the aspirational nature of such propaganda, like this poster series. Thailand could be like this if you only believe in the king, Buddhism, the heteronormative family, capitalist-led development, and the moral value of social hierarchy. And these are all themes that I will address in greater detail in the project ahead. So thank you for listening on this beautiful day. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Actually, there are a few more posters I could just show really quickly. There are a lot of, like I said, there are 30 posters. And I do think it's amazing that artists were asked to somehow draw a visual of something like spying or the right to privacy, as this one often gets interpreted. This one's rather obvious, freedom of religion. Here's another one about the family and the atomization of the family in communist countries versus, you know, like the multi-generational family, always rural, always in this abundant areas in the countryside. This one I really like. It's like a nod to foreign policy in Thailand, which is so welcoming to people from all over the world. Anyway, I will stop sharing now, but I encourage you all to take a look at the posters that are available online. And I'm happy to answer any questions if people have them.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic talk, incredibly interesting. I had never seen those works of art that you opened with, and so that was really neat for me to see as the digital librarian who watches over those posters in the first place, to see how they've been interpreted and reused.
I'm hoping and actually bring Tassamai's parts of his collection, the smaller parts of his collection, to Cornell in 2025. And maybe Cornell can actually buy a couple of the pieces so that we can use them in teaching. But anyway, go ahead.
I'm biased, of course, but I think that's a great idea. Keep me updated. We now have some time, about 15 minutes or so, for questions. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also raise your hand and unmute if you'd like. I'll get us started with one question while you all think a bit. You talked a bit about how sort of the challenges of finding these posters, right? You use the phrase "hunt them down," and you talked at one point about how it took you a year to find that USIS survey. So I was hoping you could explain a little bit more. What was that process like? What did the hunt involve?
Probably something only people who love archives can appreciate. It just involved a lot of going through USIS, the USIA documentation at NARA is massive. And so looking for any reference to Thailand in their guide, their online guides for the catalog, that's how I would do it. And I spent a lot of time there, but yeah, I just had to read through them all. And a lot of it wasn't relevant, but then you'd find in reading widely, you'd find these little details. But it's kind of a time sinkhole, which is why historians take years to write their books. But it's very fun. I could live in the archives.
We all hope as archivists and librarians that we're slowly but surely making that an easier process for folks like yourself.
Well, it's not digitized, I should say that. And that would
Yeah.
help. Not that I'm always pro digitization, but in this case, it'd be nice to have kind of character recognition, and you could find some of it, but then you lose out on seeing the context within which these documents are placed. So
we could talk way more about that, but I'll let Mike go ahead and Mike, you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Tamara. Thank you for that great presentation. I'm curious about when you were in Thailand, and I guess in some of your just general searches, did you have any success with the Thai Public Relations Department at all?
I actually didn't look in that archive. I went to the Thai National Archive, which I know better, and I looked in the Ministry of Public Health for some information, and I looked in a couple of other ministries just to dig through and see what I could find. And I was very targeted because I had a small amount of time. So I was looking for the 1950s and the 1960s, anything to do with communism. But of course, you couldn't have any of that copied. You'd have to hand copy it. So I did find some things. I found some things about prostitution, but I did not go to public affairs. I didn't look through public affairs. But I would love to talk to you about it. Did you go?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Matthew's still on here. Yeah, him and I have had conversations about trying to get in there, and I did get in, but I wasn't able to do anything on my own, and they don't really have much. But so yeah, I was just curious to see if you had cracked the department.
I did
And
not
maybe
try, but maybe
so.
next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Eric, please go ahead.
Hi, Tamara.
Hi, Eric.
So I'm wondering, maybe I missed this. I was kind of distracted at one point in the middle in the talk. Do we have much ideas about literally like where the posters were, where they were put up, where Thais would have been encountering them, like what kind of contexts?
Mostly schools. So schools were the main place. They also posted them at like the village head's house, like outside of the house. Once in a while, but very rarely were they at a temple, but that was pretty rare. And they remarked on that but it was schools these packets were sent every month to like Puyaban and to school districts. So they were teaching young kids. They were aiming at young kids.
And were there a lot of posters for, a village? Was it just a few? I mean, was it just one set? Was it a full set? Selective sets? Because you said there was like 40 or something, right?
Well, every month they sent different things. So this was just one random survey that I found that actually matched up to some of the posters I found. But they, in the survey documentation, they talk about the distribution of packets every single month to village or to rural leaders. So abbots, they would send them to teachers, and they would send them to, Puyaban, basically, and expected to distribute them from there. And often there weren't enough to distribute, so there was always complaints that there weren't enough. But yeah, that's all I could find out about that. They do have a lot of information like that. Thanks, Eric.
Moon, I see you in the chat have a question. Feel free to unmute yourself, and then David, I'll have you ask your question after Moon.
Hi, Professor. My apologies if you went over this earlier. I came to the talk late, but I know you said that your period of time that you were specifically researching was the 50s and 60s. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess I just have a question. I'm interested about those prostitution related materials that you briefly mentioned you encountered when you were looking through, I think it was, what was it, the Public Relations Department, someone said, or was it?
Ministry of Health.
Ministry of Health. But other than that, I'm also wondering if while doing your search, you encountered, material from the 1970s, particularly around the time of the October 6th massacre.
I am trying to bracket this, and I'm just much more interested in the 50s and the 60s, partially because the 70s is really dominated by the study of the student protests. So I've decided not to, if that comes up, I will accept it, but I'm not actively searching for that, just because I feel like this earlier period, the 50s is super interesting and the 60s as well. So I didn't find anything about the students. I actually haven't looked at much documentation for the 1970s. I go up to about 69, at least for the USIS materials so far. The prostitution data I found, which was there wasn't a lot, was from the 1950s, and I haven't actually sat down and analyzed it yet, but there were a couple things that I found notable. One is that some of the prostitutes were G'tay. I find that interesting. And two, it's a lot of the Thai archival documentation about prostitutes is totally siloed off from the R&R bases where there's also prostitution. So I could see nothing in the Thai documentation from the little I've seen so far. So it's very possible it could be out there. Didn't talk about Westerners at all.
That's
but
super interesting.
but
Oh,
yeah,
sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
it is interesting, but then you can find some information about that in USIS materials in English. So I do find it perplexing that that Thailand has this reputation for having an explosion in prostitution because of US soldiers there. But there's so little
Yeah.
in Thai about it, except maybe in the newspapers. But even that, it doesn't talk about, so I will be looking at that, and I do find it really interesting, what we think we know versus maybe what actually was going on.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Thank you, Moon. David, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you for your talk. This will be a brief technical question also about the timelines. You mentioned the 50s and 60s. So how does the production of these posters relate to the communist insurgency that started only in the mid-60s? So the posters were produced before, essentially.
Oh yeah, they're produced before. So I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but the Manila, I'm going to forget the exact name of the place where all of these materials were produced, but it was in Manila, which makes sense because of it being a former US colony, and after World War II ended, the US came back with a lot of funding, a lot of similar anti-communist kind of propaganda going on there. But these materials were produced in Manila. They had a huge production center, which no longer exists apparently. And they were just pumping out USIS materials for all of Asia through this center. And so some of the Thai materials are produced in Thai for Thai audiences. Some of the materials just get Thai captions and Thai translations of material that's translated into Chinese and Tagalog and all kinds of other, Vietnamese, all kinds of other languages of Asia. And so I think that accounts for why you see these materials earlier than what's actually going on in Thailand. It's not always directly responding to Thailand. It's really a US attempt to cover Asia in 2 inches of paper.
Thank you so much for your
You're
answer.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat about how USIS Thailand also produced movies. And so I just want to let everyone know the Southeast Asia Digital Library, we're currently working with the Thai Film Archive to digitize a selection of Cold War era films. And I'm not entirely familiar with what the content of all those individual films are, but stay tuned. It's a really exciting collection that will be coming soon.
Excellent.
I've got another question in the chat from Thanavi saying, I've noticed that most images, in contrast to the images of the happy life of the non-communist Thailand, seem to have Maoist references more than others. Is that the case, or is that specific to this selected collection here?
No, that's the case. There are a couple that reference Vietnam, but it's really focused on China. So it's a good question because, again, like David's earlier question, it shows that some of this production of material is being produced for all of Asia, right? And it's not being produced in response to something going on in Thailand per se. And the biggest challenge for the Americans after 1949 was the PRC. And so China is really targeted. But there are a couple I have found that include Vietnam. There are definitely comic books that target Ho Chi Minh, but only one or two of the posters.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue into the next question, which was asking about the comic books, which are included, at least in the NIU collection, alongside the posters. Could you elaborate a bit on how those comic books differ from the standalone posters?
I actually am not covering, I have not had a chance to read the comic books, and I'm not sure if I will. The ones I've looked at are those produced by Paiute, just because for a while I was really trying to figure out what his political stance was. If he was just working for USIS or if he, held anti-communist beliefs and if that mattered. He produced a comic book that was based on a kind of journalistic trip he took with Thai soldiers who were part of the war in Vietnam, something Rick Ruth has written about. So Paiute went there and then created a comic book based on that experience. So I know some of this material, but not all of it. There's actually a great book out about Thai cartoonists that includes some of this. That whoever asked that question, if they want me to, I can send you the information about that. But there's so much material. There are films, there's comic books, there's these posters, and I was just like attracted visually to the posters. They're like eye candy. They're very intriguing. But there's so much material. It's a really rich resource if people want to explore the comic book part of this.
We're just approaching the hour, but I'm going to ask one last question. This is from Thanapat in the chat. Say, if I remember correctly, you said that you started by looking at primary sources. And so could you elaborate a bit on just in general your approach to research with primary sources? It's a lot for 1 minute, but I want to make sure we get everything in the chat.
Well, I think they're just much more exciting because it's your direct interaction with materials and your interpretation as opposed to reading what other people have written about it. And so if I read all the secondary materials first, I would probably never write another book, especially about the Cold War, because there's so much out there. But I believe that we each bring something unique to our interpretation of those sources. And so that's why I went that direction first, just started reading what was out there. And I have a lot more to do on that score, but I find it much more exciting I don't know if that's you probably wanted a more technical answer, but for me, it's just about what makes you excited about the project.
No, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for your talk today and for generously answering our questions this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who's attended for coming out on a Friday afternoon to spend your time with us here. We hope to see you again at future events, and I please encourage you to check out these collections yourself online and in person if possible. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.